Hey everyone, welcome to Climb by VSC. Each week we interview innovative founders, category experts, and the most active climate investors about their perspectives, lessons, and best practices for company building in climate tech. Today I am thrilled to be joined by my friend Rob Leclerc. Rob is founder of AgFunder. I'm going to take that again. Rob is the founding partner of AgFunder with over 15 years of experience as a scientist and engineer. Among many other things, Rob and I are going to discuss why food and ag tech needs to be considered as a vital part of the conversation around climate change and climate tech. Rob, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me on, Jay.
Well, let's kick things off, man. I want to talk a little bit about your background and how that led you into your current role as the founding partner of AgFunder.
Sure. So my background, I'm Canadian. I did a master's in AI and virtual robotics, went to Yale for a PhD in computational biology. My plan was to be an academic. But as I was coming up to my graduation, I started to talk to some people, and basically my journey was going to look something like spend 10 years as a postdoc, as a journeyman postdoc, and then maybe I'd be lucky to get an associate professor position. So I kind of started to look out into the world, had a job lined up at Lehman Brothers in late 2007. That started to slide. As a PhD, you have a few exit routes. And then job interviews at McKinsey et al. Were canceled in October 2008. And this was sort of an end of the world type of scenario. There was just so much uncertainty at the time, and I was really focused on where is the stable areas of the world? And I came to food and agriculture, right? Like energy prices were diving, but at the end of the day, people were just not going to stop eating, and it was a kind of a frame where people were really thinking about the tangible things in the world. And so after a lot of informationals and meetings, I met my partner today, Michael Dean, and Michael was a former M&A lawyer, and he had left his practice to set up a food and agriculture business in West Africa. So I joined him there, and I'll fast forward, about two and a half years, there was basically we were put out of business when there was a coup in the country we were operating in Mali, and so this was kind of a culmination, and we were put out of business, and it would be uninvestable for many years to come. But when we sort of stepped back, we said, look, do we believe in the space? Yes, Africa's really hard. And then, where can we sort of better focus our time and energy? And really me coming from this deep tech background, I was kind of pushing Michael, who had this law background, and said, look, I think there's real opportunity to bring sort of technology. And there's so much you can do and bring to food and ag with tech. And at the time, there was only maybe 5 interesting companies, Blue River and Climate Corp on the farm tech side, and Impossible, Just and Beyond were very early. And so we started to talk to some, potential LPs. I'll put that in scare quotes, right? Because we thought they were potential LPs, but they probably didn't. And the take home is you guys have no venture experience. There's only really 5 companies you can really come to me and get me excited about. There's been no exits in this space. And more importantly, I just don't care, right? And so what we realized ultimately, right, is there's this broken narrative that people just didn't see this as an interesting and viable space. So, we kind of took a step back and then started by building a publication. You can kind of think as information as sort of essential to the supply chain of innovation, right? And that was really a missing piece in there. So we started with a publication called AgFunder News. And we grew that. We have about 100,000 subscribers to our weekly newsletter now. And then in 2017, we launched our first funds. It just started with some proof of concept funds and then micro VC funds. And now we're on the path of closing a $100 million fund with about 80 million closed to date.
That is fantastic in so many different directions. I want to take that, especially with using a media publication to start a fund, which is now so much in vogue, but I feel like 2017 was still really early days. Let's get to that in a bit. Let's talk a little bit about setting the table, so to speak, when it comes to food tech and ad tech. When we hear more and more news stories about how climate change is impacting food production and what challenges we can sort of look to in 2040, it feels kind of abstract. Help us understand, what are the risks to the future of food and agriculture that we're facing today?
Yeah, so I mean, look, this is a real macro level thesis, right? And that does keep it somewhat abstract, but ultimately we have a growing population, higher caloric demands per unit, and then of course higher protein demands, which then even takes a lot more into the system. And basically, the math comes out that you effectively need to double production, double capacity, double supply chain. But all of the things that we've done in the past to get there, right? Say from the 1930s, 1940s, with mechanization, hybrids and genetically modified crops, etc. And a lot of land expansion and water use, we just don't have available anymore. We've used those. And so there's a real challenge on how do we meet that, right, without contributing to more climate change, increasing carbon footprint, using less water, less land, and so there's a real just fundamental challenge and puzzle that needs to be solved. And I think when you don't solve these things, you start to see what's happening in the world today, right? When we started. It was actually, we went out of business effectively working in Africa because it was Arab Spring. So Gaddafi was killed during Arab Spring. His mercenary army came back to Timbuktu in northern Mali. They took over the region we were working in. There was a massacres. I mean, there's real geopolitical instability when people cannot afford to eat, particularly in sort of vulnerable areas of society. We're seeing these things happen in Sri Lanka right now. We're seeing a lot of places in the world, and that's just not good for anybody, right? Whether you're an American or certainly if you're Sri Lankan. So there's real world consequences to this, right? And that also means that there's real world implications that these must be solved, not just must be solved in the abstract sense, right? That necessity is the mother of invention, and so we fundamentally need to go out and solve these problems. Now, venture capital is one tool to do that. It's not the only tool, but we think there's an opportunity to leverage venture capital to really try to address some of these issues at a global scale.
Let's talk about where venture capital plays into this ecosystem. So, you mentioned Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods and sort of the early days of that. Help us understand the spectrum of companies that you're looking at and maybe certain subsegments that really excite you at AgFunder.
Yeah, so we invest across the food and ag value chain, right? We've invested in everything from 23andMe of soil to grocery delivery to food commerce companies and alternative protein companies, and then everything in between. So we see a lot of problems or lack of innovation in our food system, right? And we're starting to kind of get the types of technologies that work well with atoms to start sort of addressing some of that technology. Again, we come at this in a very broad and macro sense, and ultimately, what is food and ag? It's supplying us with goods and services, but it's also leveraging and harnessing biology, right, for those goods and services. So it's a little bit different than something like mining. We've invested in companies like MycoWorks, which is making alternative leather from mushrooms, right? And they're working with Hermes and some super iconic brands that will be sort of announced later this year. And so if you sort of take this really wide aperture view, there's actually a lot to invest in. And I think we tracked about $50 billion of global investment in the space in the broad sense last year, right? So, and which is not surprising. In some sense, people go, "Wow, that's big," but food and ag is an industry that represents about 10% of GDP and is responsible for, employing a huge number of people, and every single one of us are consumers, right? We may not all use Facebook or Instagram or Salesforce, but everybody fundamentally does eat. So,
yeah, no, it's a fantastic point in the sense of it's the hidden scale of something, right? And as we as VCs are always talking about market size and TAM, are there segments that you feel like are overhyped from that standpoint? To me, it comes to mind like synthetic meats or milk alternatives. Are there categories that you just see as sort of maybe past their prime?
Yeah. So, I think There is a lot of, I think you hit on some of that here, right? I mean, you go into the grocery aisle and there's some very, very good dairy alternatives right now. Is there a Peter Thiel kind of opportunity to make, a 10x improvement from there? Maybe not. There's still probably quite a bit of work to do in the alternative meat space, whether it's plant-based or cell ag. But there's a lot of companies already in the space, right? And they're, I would say they're well-funded or extraordinarily well-funded and often too well-funded, right? And there's just a big question mark in that, are these food companies or are they technology companies? And how should we be valuing them? They've been valued as tech companies, but as, I think what we're seeing from Beyond Meat, I don't know what the current price is, but they had very, very, very low margins, and they're with 600 million in sales. They were sort of a $1.5 billion, valuation. So these things are putting a lot of downward pressure on some companies that were Series A, Series B that just raised 100, 200, 300 million dollars, right? And so that the rationale is if Beyond Meat is their North Star, and that company is only valued 2x of what they are. It's going to be a tough climb. So I could certainly see investors foreclosing on some of these areas. There's areas that are I think when we look out in the world, there's a lot less opportunity for surprise. You know where the problems are, right? But it's just like, do we have the technology fundamentally to solve it? Do we have the capital, and do we have the team around that? And so I think generally we try to be patient around there. Every once in a while, I think you do get some surprises, and I think climate is a really good example of that, where you wouldn't have necessarily thought about some of these companies 20 years ago. You would have just gone about your business. And so we're an investor in a company called Kula Bio, which basically has nitrogen sequestering microbes, right? And you can put that in the soil, and it replaces synthetic fertilizer. And of course, today it's more expensive than synthetic fertilizer. And the idea is that over time that'll come down. And there's a lot of benefits to it, but you wouldn't have necessarily thought about that 15 years ago when synthetic fertilizer was really cheap and no one was really tying this equation together with like its impact on climate, right? And the sort of the emissive aspects of that and what Haber-Bosch contributes. So, I think if you sort of tie these things together, you start to see some innovation, like some areas of surprise, because the climate has shifted and we want to sort of find those solutions. Alternative leather would be another one, right? So again, these are things that probably would have flown 20 years ago, but I think the culture and zeitgeist has shifted.
When you speak about that, it was actually exactly my sort of thing, given that, we come from a PR background, you've built a publication around this. Where have you seen those trends shift? Whether is it consumer demand? Is it the farmers themselves that are changing their practices because they're trying to future-proof themselves? What's kind of been I know it's a chicken and the egg problem a little bit, but what's been the catalyst that's moved people towards more sustainable agricultural practices?
Yeah, I think the consumer is playing a big role here. We tend not to invest in a lot of B2B companies. We want to see, the market pull through, and ultimately the consumer has to buy the products, right? And the consumer, if you're talking about innovation, typically there's a premium in the beginning because you're not at scale, and so you have to convince the consumer to buy, a more expensive product, and so it has to have some benefit to them. When you go to a farmer and say, "Look, let's, here's some amorphous benefit to somebody else, but not your bottom line," right? It's just a hard sell. So. My preference is to invest in companies where, in some way, shape, or form, there's ultimate pull through from the consumer side. Now, again, not always. We've invested in robotics companies. We're fundamentally, there's a real pain point and problem that's being faced that a technology can solve. But if basically the benefit has to be very, very, very clear when you're selling to farmers.
Where does government play into this? It's the big sort of elephant in the room, sort of that standpoint. But you mentioned Sri Lanka. You mentioned sort of other unrest that happens when we don't have resilient food, ecosystems. Is our government doing enough? Are other governments internationally doing enough? Where's the there?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe this sort of the libertarian, in me that's going to come out, and I just don't really have a lot of faith in government to really solve any of these problems. Right? There's, maybe they put policies in place that just sort of effectively changes the rules of the game a bit. But you have different administrations, and so if I would prefer not to invest in a company that had a great dependency on the whims of government, basically, right? So in that respect, I think it's, again, I might be just sort of overly critical of the role of government and policy. I think for really truly sustainable investments, and sustainable in the sense that they can grow and scale and they add value, they probably have to do so regardless of what the government thinks, right? So it has to benefit the consumer and the farmers, and it has to work with the supply chain, right? And it has to sort of fill out that story. The government will be responsive to what the consumer thinks, right? And they'll try to pass policies, but I see them more as a trailing indicator on all of this.
That's so interesting to me, just given, when you sort of peel back the onion on how much subsidy capital, especially in the US, goes to, generally speaking, it's like corn and soy. But when you think about how much of our tax dollars are subsidizing our agricultural supply chain, I'm actually surprised by the fact that there isn't more of a shift in government to say we need to be, becoming more independent. We can't be focused on importing most of our food and vegetables, because we've seen supply chain issues impact things like microchips. Who's to say that our food supply from other countries is not next? So when you're evaluating companies for investment, how do you think about that from a cross-border standpoint in terms of what we grow here versus as the U.S. what is a net import still?
Yeah, I mean that's interesting because the U.S. is in probably the most envious position in the world, right? They've got a tremendous amount of land. It's really one of the biggest growers and producers in the world, right? So and there's so many climates that we can grow against. I think the challenge is let's say we can't get blueberries, from Chile anymore, for instance. We can still feed the population here. So, that's less, the challenge that, I would say American growers are facing is typically around labor and costs, and labor being one of them, input costs being another. There may be the pressures that the government is putting on, chemical reduction and stuff, particularly in Europe, that you may kind of lean into and say, look, there's probably more secular trend here that you can maybe invest in. But so I'd say we don't in the U.S. we don't kind of put a lot of weight on that. Now, again, costs are increasing. We know that minimum wages are increasing. Importing labor is challenging. So maybe we invested a lot in robotics companies, and the next administration comes in and has some massive farm visa that kills all of our automation companies, right? Because now all of a sudden there's a flood of labor. I don't necessarily think that's going to be the case, but there's certainly those kind of risks in place.
So you mentioned earlier that a couple of things that you're really trying to check for in the companies you're investing in is is this a food company or is this a tech company? Are there other sort of check marks that you're looking at when it comes to the founders or the market opportunity that makes something a great deal for Rob?
Sure. Yeah. And I'm one of 4 partners on our team. And so, we have a lot of debate and different preferences. I think, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So, I come from this deep tech background. I tend to gravitate to really brilliant technical founders who can, show me around and teach me something new. So that would be one. N of one is really important, I think, to me. I don't think I'm smart enough to both pick a company out of a crowded field and then navigate them through so that they become the winner, right? And I think that's what you have to do in a bit of a noisier market. So I do kind of gravitate to like it's the classic question, like, what if everything goes right? And so just being part of those really big ideas that you could be really proud to tell your kids about. And sometimes we come across companies that just seem very pedestrian, right? So it's just that's fine. Maybe it's a great company. Maybe we could get a good return on it, but it lacks something human in the narrative. And then I would sort of link that really deeply technical founder with founders, or at least one of the founders who's also really good at telling stories, right? And telling the narrative and can really bring you into the future, right? And tell you why now, what's special. And so, it's sort of the classic, like, we invest in exceptional founders. Everyone talks about it. I don't know if we index more or less on it, but it's certainly something that we try to focus on.
I mean, your point about having a founder that can tell a story is, music to our ears, right? Because that's where we spend a lot of our time at VSC with the founders that we work with. What I'll pick up on there a little bit is, you've also got AgFunder News, and you've got, as you said, 100,000 subscribers that you've built over this time. How does that interplay with the companies that you invest in, be it customers, future leads, future hires? Where have you seen that kind of play to your benefit?
Yeah. So, so again, when we started, I think, we had reached out to TechCrunch and we'd said, hey, we've got some ideas, and they just sort of shot us down, right? And so we kind of realized that we had to sort of, pick up the ball and run with it and build that narrative. And so where AgFunder News comes in, and keep in mind, we do keep some separation between church and state. We've got a full-time media team. They've got, I try to stay out of their business as much as possible. And they have tremendous autonomy. We are certainly a friend of the industry in general, right? And so even there, we cover a lot of other, competitive firms, they're friendly firms. And even competitor portfolio companies. But I guess where it would benefit is, look, the company is reaching out to get coverage on something, and it can be very difficult. We've ended up building a lot of great relationships with a lot of other journalists at a lot of the other publications, and they follow AgFunder News. It's sort of like there's the generalists follow the specialists, right? And so there's an amplification effect. We cover our companies and why we invested pieces and give them basically a platform to kind of announce things that they're doing, where we might not normally do that with every company, just because we would just be completely overwhelmed with the amount of content that we could put out. And some examples of this, right, are that we one of our portfolio companies that we just covered a few weeks ago, they're like, wow, we got 2,200 visits to our site, and we had a whole bunch of investor leads and customer leads, and there's a whole bunch of publications that shot us down for covering the round, and they called us back, and so they, it's that little nudge of serendipity. Like, basically, startups need all the help that they can get. They, whatever wind you can put at their back, the better. And then the other big benefit of a publication is with 100,000 subscribers, our portfolio companies will say, do you know anybody at company X, right? And I'll be like, I don't know, I've never heard of that company, right? And so we could just basically do a reverse lookup and see what subscribers are there. I'll personally email them, and when you have people who may have been subscribers for 4 years that that open your email every week, they're actually pretty excited to talk, and so that's been a great opportunity for us to connect our portfolios with customers and partners, and then just the kind of that presence, we know that CEOs, board members, heads of R&D, heads of business development read AgFunder news religiously from these major corporations, right? And so if we can give a little bit of a nudge by shining, the spotlight of attention, not necessarily, on our portfolio companies, slightly more, right? And we cover, in our newsletter, we kind of call out, here's an article in Bloomberg with one of our portfolio companies, et cetera. It just sort of, again, tips things in the direction. And it seems like, I don't have any good verifiable, evidence of this, that they get called more often by other investors and press and stuff like that. So again, trying to tip the odds in their favor. And we, and then our responsibility as an investor is to really curate really well, right? So that we don't embarrass ourselves and that and our portfolio.
Well, and I certainly feel like, one, thank you for that. I remember this anecdote from Glossier, which seems like a non sequitur, but it'll make sense in a second. When she initially launched her newsletter, it was just about reviewing other brands. And it built up to millions of followers who were giving her feedback on what they didn't see in the market, which then led to, Emily creating her own fashion brand that's now gone on to be $1 billion business. It's that idea of feedback loops. Yep. So are you starting to see feedback from your readership or from the people that are sort of in the AgFunder ecosystem to have more interest in food tech and ag tech? Is the sort of interest in this growing? And why is that growing?
Yeah, I think our audience in some ways is getting, bigger and broader, and certain types of articles will just get shared around, right? So I think ultimately, again, you need this information out there to have any kind of movement, and a conference once a year for 500 people just doesn't cut it, right? And there's no broader sense of community and sense of what's going on and all the gossip in the world and stuff like that. You don't really get from that. So I would say certainly that's part of the case, and our media team is really good at keeping us in the loop on the things that they're seeing. So we sync up with them, and they often refer a portfolio company because they're talking to startups and investors all the time. And so they'll be like, hey, did you see this company? They were really interesting. They're really early. So it's another set of eyes. They look at the world in a different lens than we do. Right. And they talk to a lot of people that we don't necessarily spend our day talking to. So I think we get some calibration on where things are going.
Let's chat company building for a couple minutes here. What do you think is the biggest thing that founders maybe overlook or underestimate when they are building a business in sort of food tech or ag tech broadly?
Yeah, so there's probably a lot of things they overlook, and also a lot of things that VCs overlook. So I don't want to just put founders into the bucket. I think we all come in really, with rose-colored glasses, and then reality hits us in the face. And there's all these things that we didn't necessarily think about. Working in the world of atoms is really hard and slow. So there's always I would say overestimation on adoption, and this may be just universal to all founders, right? So, and I would say. I think a lot of founders think that they need to sort of go from 0 to 1, and they don't really break things down into a series of smaller steps that are more climbable. And just even an example, in this market, it's the last couple of years, it might be common to go and raise a $15 to $20 million Series A, which 4 years ago would have been a really big Series A, and 10 years ago would have been Series D round or something, right? So, and to hear a founder say like, look, the minimum that we can raise a Series A at is 15 million. I'm like, I think you can probably build a company for less than 15 million on a Series A, and you're not thinking creatively enough, and you're thinking maybe your ambitions are a little too high, and you're overestimating what you can probably accomplish. And so how can we break that down into sort of some more manageable steps? I'd say that would be a big one, is when the other thing, obviously you probably see this as well, and all is is I think founders really need to take some time. I mean, you're going to spend a lot of time on this, and it helps to kind of put your MBA hat on and say, look, does this actually make sense, right? Now, go through the Excel spreadsheet, go through the, bottoms up TAM, figure out, is there a large enough market here? Because you don't want to be spending a lot of time, you don't want to spend, dedicate a good portion of your life to doing something that's not going to be big, or it's really noisy. And so, I think we turn down a lot of opportunities just because they're not going to be big enough for us, and they're not going to have the right return profile. So I would say that. And then finally, I think founders are very influenced by what they see on TechCrunch and others, and there's a huge selection bias that, there, and that's often not, and even then, it's always kind of framed really nicely, and so. But they'll anchor on those, and I don't think that that's necessarily a good thing. I think they can be miscalibrated. Funding sizes and what they should be doing and where they should, and they'll beat themselves up about it as well. So
we say that quite often to founders. I'm glad you brought that up about the selection bias, because it's like, look, your PR should accomplish a goal, right? It's either to help you get new customers, which is usually the goal. Sometimes it's to close some key hires, and you want those public proof points. And occasionally it's to go raise that next round of funding. And every time I meet a founder that wants PR that doesn't have one of those three goals in the immediacy, it's like, well, then we don't have anything to talk about right now. Like, go focus heads down building product. Yep. And I think the folks that look at PR as a pat on the back or the ego boost or whatever are kind of missing the point. And I'm glad you mentioned that. It's like, don't worry about the selection bias as a first time founder in the space. Do you have a goal to go do some kind of press and announcement? And if you don't, let's get back to building companies, right? Ultimately, I'm sure you guys turn away stories on the media side as well for similar reasons.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. On the point about building in the world of atoms versus bits taking a little bit longer, does that change how you think about your time horizons, the stages that you invest at? Talk a little bit about sort of where you come in, and then how long you stay with those companies, through subsequent rounds. Yeah,
I mean, we structure our funds as 10-year venture capital funds, just like everybody else. The 2 1-year extensions. We do have to think about what does that funding look like. I think our space ends up carrying a lot more finance risk than a pure software play, where we know that there's a whole bunch of generalist investors dedicated to kind of investing in those spaces. That said, right, investing in the world of atoms can, and I think a lot of VCs kind of miss this. I think it was Paul Graham talked about things being a slog, and you got to go through the slog. But a slog is a moat, right? And when you're working in the world of atoms, and you've got to go through the problems, learn from them, revise your system and algorithms, right? It means it's really hard for somebody to jump in and take over, particularly something like, robotics is an example, right? That where you really do need that feedback, that environmental feedback loop and all the data labeling, and you only get that by going out in the field and doing it. That once you're 3 or 4 years in, it's going to be really difficult for anybody to catch up, because they have to go and do the slog. Whereas if I go and create some sort of software business that doesn't intrinsically have high network effects, it can be really easy for you to be fighting 30 other companies, right? So what is the terminal value of that company, and in an expected value scenario, right? When it invites so much competition. We're investors in a company called Verdant Robotics, and the team came from Waymo and Cruise Automation and Zoox, and it's like these were foundational engineers in the driverless car industry, just a mind-blowing technical team. They've been working on this company now for about 3 years, and there's just no one's going to ever catch them. So they're creating something of deep value, right? That no one is going to be able to replicate. So, we see that as a very strong moat. And it's part of it. The moat is that they are working in that world of atoms. Now, I think most VCs though are still a little hesitant to invest in hardware and the world of atoms. I think the value accrues later on, right? And so you've got to it's a little bit white knuckle sometimes, even when you're investing in these great teams that the fundraising won't be quite there like a fast growing software business.
Well, that's your moat, right? Your willingness to take that slog and be in those companies a little bit longer, and that's your moat against the traditional software VCs. I mean, we see that, right? I mean, I think about companies that would traditionally raise a Series A or a Series B from a specialist investor. At least last year had the likes of Tiger and Cotu competing for those same rounds. Now, as the tide washes out, we'll kind of see who's still there and backing those companies. Do you have a perspective on sort of what makes for a good lead for a food and ag tech, founder when they're looking to put together their round? What should they be looking for in a lead investor?
Yeah, I mean, look, maybe I'm old school. Again, and I think our space carries a lot of financing risk. I think the role of VC is often curative. I think a lot of VCs add negative value. So I have a pessimistic view of venture capital. And when I talk to lots and lots of founders who have, great firms on their cap table, I don't necessarily get the sense that those firms are adding tremendous value, right? So that the founder is largely responsible for getting things done, right? And so, where we try to add value, is think about like, what do you need? And let's try to go get it. And let's try to use our network and the AgFunder brand to go get it. And so, founders need partners, talent, customers, investors, right? And so having that network and being available to kind of deliver that, that's where we've certainly seen quite a bit of value. I would say there's certain areas where it's really helpful, particularly when you have a first-time founder who is working with VCs who have had companies that go through something before, just so that they can either, whether it might be bringing in board members, just helping provide a little bit of guidance so that they don't step on some traps would be the sort of the other thing. But I do think capital solves a lot of problems. When you have Sequoia and Andreessen come in early, that company, you take away a lot of financing risk, when you do that. And so I think those tend to be, if you look at some of the biggest exits in this space, they tend to have been backed by, top tier Silicon Valley firms. And I don't think that's an accident. I remember talking to Jorge at Blue River about their acquisition and, by John Deere and apparently Vinod Khosla came in and really ran the show. And I talked to another ag tech VC who said, look, if it was us, we would have went in and negotiated at a $300 million exit and would have been talked down to 100 million. But, Vinod comes in and slams his fist on the table and says, I'm not selling this company for less than $1 billion. Right. And he's built, hundreds and hundreds of companies, and they've got a big fund, and they can talk the talk and get behind it. So, I think there's critical moments in time where a VC can be helpful to a founder, but founders should realize that like they know best. They're spending 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week on a company thinking about it, but think about the brand as well, and because I do think that can be helpful, because there is a lot of financing risk, and no one wants to. The Tigers and you probably saw this, Tigers and SoftBanks. I mean, they invest up or down, downstream from other VC firms that they know. So that's just the way the world works. So you got to be aware of that. Yeah,
no, very, very fair. I guess where we'll close then is knowing what you know now, and this is sort of more of a perspective for you as an investor, knowing what you know now about investing in this category, what is some advice that you wish you could give your younger self?
Geez, that's a tough question because I think there's still so much to learn all the time. And, I would say, learn decision process a lot earlier than I did. I think this is something that I picked up a couple of years ago. Really thinking about how to craft that and really be comfortable with the decision that you make. And, you get to a point where in asking the question, look, if the outcome was different, would I still make the same decision, right? And so I think that would have been helpful to avoid a few errors, in there where maybe I would have been a little more hopeful. So.
Intellectual honesty is one of the hardest parts of this job, man. I'm 100% with you. 7-8 years into my investing career, to go back and be like, I think I had it right, but I know that luck was also involved.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very hard to almost take it away from yourself a little bit and say, yeah, you had some of the puzzle pieces, but you also got lucky. And I think a lot of folks in our business refuse to sort of go that second step and realize that, sometimes also bad luck plays into it, right? You might have had all the pieces right in the market when you invested, but there was bad luck that played into that company or sort of what happened with them. And so
absolutely.
I subscribe to that wholeheartedly. Well, Rob, I think we'll close there, man. This was fantastic. I think the biggest thing that I'm really taking away here is that, food and agricultural supply chains need to be talked about in the broader scheme of how climate change is impacting really every aspect of our life.
Yep.
But then I think for founders specifically building in this category, finding investors that are willing to be patient with them, finding investors that are willing to take on some of that financing risk, and just aligning your long-term outlook with an investor's long-term outlook. Because there are investors that, especially in the last couple of years, have been really eager about some quick hits. And you and I have been around this business long enough to know that there's a reason the fund is a 10-year life, right?
Yeah.
You have to be willing to commit that long. So that's sort of my biggest takeaway here. Rob, thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything that you would like to plug or somewhere that our listeners can come and find you?
You can always see our portfolio at agfunder.com. We've invested in some great companies, and Jay, hopefully we have an opportunity to work together too.